Well, hey everyone, it's Rob. We want to welcome you to another one of our live streams here. This is part of the Christian Forum on Israel, Palestine, as well as Determined Truth live stream. According to a United Nations report from last week, since October of 2023, Israel has killed 69,546 Palestinians in Gaza, of whom 20,171 are children, and another 170,833 have been wounded in Gaza alone. And the death toll is surely much higher. In the West Bank, Israeli settler attacks have escalated exponentially. This year alone, 994 Palestinians have been killed. In the last month, as Palestinians attempted to harvest their olive fields, over 2,350 attacks by the Israeli army and Israeli settlers were recorded. Israeli settlers have torched Palestinian fields, trees, and homes. On October 10th, 2025, a ceasefire was enacted, which was intended to halt the violence in Gaza, return Israeli hostages and Palestinian detainees, as well as to allow the flow of food and other necessities into Gaza. Unfortunately, Israel has repeatedly violated the ceasefire. More than 1,000 Gazans have been injured or killed by Israeli bombing since the ceasefire began, and food and other life-saving essentials are still not entering the Gaza Strip at the necessary levels. So the question then is, what are the prospects for peace? So I'm joined today by my colleague from the Christian Forum in Israel, Palestine, Gary Burge. Gary, welcome.
Yep, good to be with you, Rob.
All right, thank you very much. And we are very pleased to have a very special guest today, Greg Khalil. Greg is the president and co-founder of Telos, an American nonprofit that unleashes our collective power to confront injustice and to build a world where we can all flourish. Telos has been at the forefront of the conversation of Israel-Palestine, devoting special attention to helping American faith communities engage through a lens that promotes freedom, dignity, and security for both Palestinians and Israelis in equal measure. Greg is a graduate of UCLA and Yale Law School. Before founding the Telos Group, Greg lived in the West Bank city of Ramallah, where he advised the Palestinian leadership on peace negotiations with Israel. Although Greg was born and raised in San Diego, California, much of his extended family still lives in Beit Sahor, a predominantly Palestinian Christian town near Bethlehem. He has lectured widely in the Middle East and has published in the Review of Faith and International Affairs and the New York Times. Greg is an adjunct professor at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. He's a really good guy. So, Greg, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks, Rob. Real honored to be here. Thanks for that introduction.
All right. Greg, can we just begin by having you kind of maybe update us a little bit on your overall assessment on the state of affairs in Gaza and in the West Bank?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, we're talking ceasefire right now. The ceasefire, as you mentioned, really hasn't stopped the fire, and it's not yet peace. And so I know this can be really frustrating for people who want to see sort of a different reality on the ground. But right now we are in sort of a reformulation of what we saw over the last 2 years, which is a continuation of what we've seen over many decades. So the situation on the ground is really perilous and dangerous for Palestinians, both in Gaza and in the West Bank. While it may be materially an improvement based on what we saw in Gaza over the last 2 years of, I think, what nearly everyone recognizes was and still is active genocide, we're still in a very, very precarious position.
So, Greg, is the Israeli complaint that Hamas is continuing to fire on their positions, and that is why they're breaking the ceasefire?
Yeah, I mean, we've heard a lot in the news about various. There's an echo here. Do you hear that?
Yeah, I'm getting an echo from you. I'm sorry.
I just realized it's on my end.
Okay. No, I can't hear you at all. You got muted there, Greg.
Is that
now you're still an echo?
I don't understand where that's coming from.
I'm not sure.
Sorry, I hope it's not too disorienting for your audience. It was a little for me. Yeah, so we hear the complaint about Hamas fire on Israeli soldiers. That's often a typical complaint. It's impossible to assess what's actually happening on the ground right now,
Right,
because international journalists are not allowed in. They haven't been allowed in for 2 years before the ceasefire. In fact, more journalists have been killed in Israel,
Right.
Palestine, and Gaza in the last 2 years than in any conflict in recorded history, and then in most conflicts combined over the last decades. In many instances, there's evidence of journalists being targeted, even their families targeted. So a lot of the
Right.
facts are just beyond us. The facts that we're left with are the facts that you cited earlier today, which is a dated figure from probably about 18 months ago about the number of Palestinians killed. The facts that we see from the drone footage showing devastation
Right.
beyond belief. And so, Gary, your question about like who started back and forth, like we can get into the nitty gritty and argue these minor things, but
Right.
at the end of the day, what we're seeing absolute devastation of one people and their community, and what the international community has defined as a genocide, and we're not seeing the level of aid getting in for Palestinian children
So
and
I
families
guess,
to have a
Greg,
right
we,
to this too.
we even if there is fire coming during a peace process, even if there is fire coming from Hamas, it's small arms fire, I think. That's the claim. But you still have the problem of proportionality. So if you do have small arms fire coming against Israeli infantry, and then you have bombing in response, that's a very, very big difference.
It's an enormous difference, and I don't want to ignore that at all, Gary. I mean, there's an incident just a few days ago that was widely documented in which Israel reported firing at their soldiers. No one was hit or hurt, but the response was to bomb an entire building, killing dozens of people, including many, many children. And so the level of proportionality is absolutely a concern, and this is something that we've seen throughout the long history of what some call the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for decades, this question of proportionality. And now we see this on vivid display right here during a so-called ceasefire in which more than 1,000 people have been killed or injured, and in which millions of people still aren't getting the food and medical aid they need to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Now, Greg, take us back just a little bit. You've spoken to us before, and if you can just kind of rehash that a little bit. In 2005, when Israel withdrew from Gaza, one of the arguments that's been made is, well, Israel withdrew from Gaza, and look what happened. All that happened is chaos ever since. Israel tried to make peace, but you've shared with us before that the conditions actually that were left in 2005 were actually not conducive to creating peace or a lasting peace. Kind of what went wrong in those negotiations that led to where we currently are?
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to make one fundamental point about my bias coming into this. I mean, I have many biases as a Palestinian American with family in Bethlehem, and also my grandmother came from Gaza, from a Christian family. But I also have a bias about like how this all ends. That's in a good space for everyone. I believe there's no good future for any Palestinian or Israeli without a good reality for everyone. Fundamental human rights. That's the foundation of true security. And I think, I'd love to talk more about that as a conceptual
please. Absolutely.
later in the conversation. But specifically to your question, many of our listeners may not understand that we've been through this before, many times before. And last time with Gaza, the most significant moment in Gaza's recent history before October 7th, 2023, I would argue was in 2005. At that time, I was a young lawyer. I was living in Ramallah, and I was advising the Palestinian leadership on negotiations with Israel. 2004, the year before, Israel came up with a plan called the so-called Gaza disengagement plan. They were going to take what they said was an historic step for peace, and that was to remove all of their settlers from the Gaza Strip, all of their military bases from the Gaza Strip, and allow Palestinians to prove that they truly wanted peace, to take over Gaza and make it into the Singapore of the Middle East. That's what everybody said. And so when we first got this plan in 2004, I think many people were skeptical on the Palestinian side. They said, wait a second, like Israel's never going to do this, because it was proposed by Ariel Sharon, who was considered a right-wing Israeli hawk at the time, similar to Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister. And then others were like, wait a second, maybe this will happen. And this isn't really about peace. This is about something else. Where the international community landed was like, well, look, Israel's talking about removing settlements. This is what you Palestinians have been saying Israel needed to do since 1967. Of course, we're going to support them in this, and we'll do it.
So what ended up happening is that Israel actually did remove 8,000 settlers from the Gaza Strip. There were 1.3 million Palestinians at that time. 8,000 settlers were living among 1.3 million Palestinians. They controlled about a quarter of the territory. They controlled 700% more water per person than that allowed local Palestinians. Many lived in seaside villas, while Palestinians, the majority of whom in Gaza are refugees who come from lands where many of the massacres on October 7th took place, by the way. So 8,000 settlers controlling the lives of 1.3 million Palestinians, mainly children. Israel went ahead and removed them, but they didn't leave Gaza alone. So a lot of what happened in 2005 was not that Israel just left Gaza alone and allowed Palestinians to create like this Singapore on the Mediterranean. They in fact tightened their control. So what do I mean by that? At the time, UN Special Rapporteur for Peace, John Dugard, said Israel may have left Gaza, but it turned it into the world's largest open-air prison and threw away the key. So it tightened its control around Gaza. Why is this significant? Because I had actually been part of the process in which my team negotiated the agreement on movement and access, which said that like the day after Gaza, if Gaza was going to have that opportunity for Palestinians really to take agency and to become the Singapore of the Middle East, what had to happen? They needed to have a free flow of goods in and out of Gaza. Gaza needed to be connected to the West Bank. It needed to be connected to the world. The airport, which there is an airport in Gaza, needed to be open. The seaport needed to be open. Gazans, they have these incredible natural gas reserves off the coastline. They needed to be able to access that so that they could get that to market and build the economy. Gazans essentially needed their freedom and their ability to build their own territory. Now, those agreements were never actually implemented. Instead, as Dugard said, Gaza was turned into this virtual prison. And predictably, what happened was what you see everywhere, where human beings are denied their agency and their rights, and where nearly 60% of Gaza's population then and now were under the age of 18. Nothing good happens when you starve a population, seal them up, and periodically bomb them, which is what we had happen to Gaza. The one thing there that I want to highlight too is that Gaza, I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions about this, but what we thought and feared and what ended up happening was Gaza disengagement. This pullout from Gaza was more of a shell game. Right. It was had a lot more to do with the West Bank than it did with the Gaza Strip, specifically Jerusalem. And this is important to highlight because this was 20 years ago, and all of this is in the historical record, that just as Israel moved 8,000 settlers out of Gaza in 2005, in the same year, they approved and made room for 30,000 more in the West Bank. In the plan itself, the so-called disengagement plan itself, in Article 2, and you can read this online in English, was just as much about removing the claim that Gaza is occupied as entrenching control in the West Bank, building the security fences, Israelis call it, around Jerusalem, expanding settlements in the West Bank. So as they were removing this liability of Gaza, these 8,000 settlers that were a demographic threat, as they were called, well, rather than 1.3 million Palestinians, these 8,000 settlers that were a security liability to protect. It costs a lot of money to protect, a political liability on the international stage. Get rid of this small population among 1.3 million Palestinians and in exchange for something you really want, which is control of Jerusalem and the broader West Bank. That was the explicit strategy that was said back then. It's right in the plan itself. And that's, I think, part of what we see happening today, making Gaza a mess to seize control over what some, not all, but some in the Israeli government really want, which are the lands of Judea and Samaria, also known as the West Bank.
So, Greg, you say that, so Israel, 2005, Israel brings 8,000 people out, Israelis out of their settlements. Okay, that's clear. And then you use the language of open air prison. But would there be some who would say, well, wait, in that narrative between 2005, and I think the embargoes and the real ratcheting down on Gaza happens in 2008, doesn't it? 2009. And in the midst of all that, Hamas is the election. Talk about the election of Hamas, because
Right.
that seems to, in that narrative you're just describing, I'm sure you need to fit Hamas into that story someplace.
Mhm.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot here, and I think this relates to today. I'm in no way giving Hamas a pass for anything, by the way. As I alluded to earlier, I believe in fundamental human rights for everyone. I oppose anyone or anything that ever targets civilians. Hamas did that on October 7th. Hamas has done that before. Any justification for the slaughter of civilians is wrong. Now, why, there's one narrative about Gaza disengagement, which is actually quite popular among many Israelis, not because they're nefarious in their intent or whatever, but it's the story that's been told over and over, which is, look, we did everything for peace. We had Arafat, Yasser Arafat, this guy that we couldn't make peace with. And so we said, look, you Palestinians, we're going to do something very painful for us. We're going to uproot 8,000 people, Jewish people, from their homes, and then turn them over, these homes and these lands, over to you for you to finally prove that you want peace and you're not going to slaughter our kids anymore. And look what happens after that. We pull out, and then these rockets start coming from Hamas. They're makeshift rockets at first, targeting our communities, our homes, our synagogues, our schools. And you just show over and over and again that you don't really want peace. You want to get rid of us. You're not happy with us. That's a common narrative that we hear, and many people believe, because that's their experience of the facts. Now, what happened on the ground, though, is I alluded to the fact that there was this agreement on movement and access that Condoleezza Rice, actually our former Secretary of State, helped personally negotiate. This is a 9-month process on the presumption that Gaza would devolve into humanitarian and political crisis, and you'd see the rise of violence if Gazans could not control their own lives, if they didn't have their own destiny. And so you'll see that there's this narrative around it that just focuses on Hamas without looking about what actually happened on the ground.
You're saying that during the, shall we say, 2005, Israeli settlers come out. So in 2006 and 7, prior to the election of Hamas, what you had was a kind of Israeli strangulation on the area. And that led to the election of Hamas?
No, you did have, like, one, Hamas was a spoiler to begin with. So I'm not trying to give Hamas a little bit of a pass here, but Hamas is more than just like a spoiler. Like, there are two parties within Palestinian society, large parties. We're plagued here in the US, Democrats versus Republicans, Palestinians that don't really have a full democracy or control. They have Fatah and Hamas, neither of which is actually very popular and hasn't been very popular for many years among Palestinian people. What happened is there were elections in 2005 for presidential elections, head of the PLO. That's when Mahmoud Abbas, the current president of the Palestinian Authority, came into power. And then there were legislative, parliamentary, think congressional elections in 2006. That's when Hamas came into power of many districts of Palestine and the Palestinian parliament. What was interesting there, and we're getting into the weeds again, but maybe this is of interest to you and your listeners, is that there's two things that happened there. One, Gaza was strangled immediately after the engagement, starting in 2005. The agreements on movement and access were never fully implemented, despite the threat of these spoilers like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and then also on the Israeli side. And that was despite the fact that we had a 4-star US general on the ground, General Keith Dayton, who was in charge of implementing the agreements in movement and access. And so there was a lot of work that went into this, and a lot of involvement and a lot of money from the international community that went into hoping to prevent this day after Gaza from devolving into this Lord of the Flies scenario and going into instead the Singapore of the Middle East. I'm sorry to use those evocative and problematic images, but you get where I'm going right here. So that happened immediately, was never fully implemented. 2006 comes along. There are these parliamentary elections in Palestinian parliament. And this was endorsed by the U.S. The U.S. pushed for these elections, and the PLO, the PA, who I was advising at the time, were, I think, monumentally stupid. Is that they didn't want to like reform Fatah, the ruling party. This is President Abbas's party. Think the Democratic leadership, just for a basic like analogy. They didn't want to go in and like do the hard work of actually reforming their party through sort of saying, hey, this is our representative in this district, whatnot. So what they did is they used the elections as a tool for reform. What do I mean by that? You had a number of districts all over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip where elections were happening in 2006, and Fatah, the ruling party, actually went in and they ran multiple candidates, Fatah candidates, against each other on different parties. And there was one Hamas candidate.
Oh.
And so you had a couple dozen districts in which I'm blanking on the actual number. I haven't looked at the number in some years, but it was a significant number. But what happened is you had a couple dozen districts in which Fatah, had they just won one candidate, one Democratic candidate, for example, and forgive the loose analogy here, but I'm trying to make it easier for those who aren't familiar with internal, Palestinian politics. They ran multiple 2, 3, 4 candidates, again, one Hamas candidate. They split the vote. And this was with the entire support of the international community, namely the United States. And so like you had this party, the West Bank leadership, Fatah, who had been sort of marginalized in the disengagement process, because Israel said, we're doing it alone, even though you have this new president, Mahmoud Abbas, like, we're going to go through this alone and we're going to do this big process. And then you had Fatah, which has these elections and then like actually loses a majority in parliament when it should have won. It should have won in the majority of these districts had it been disciplined. And then the day after that, what happens is the US calls and it says to President Abbas, it says to Saeb Erekat, the chief negotiator, if you join them, you become them. If you form a unity government, if you work, Hamas and Fatah, if you guys work together, this is what they say to Fatah, you become them, meaning which at that time you become a target of incarceration and assassination, which was happening then to members of Hamas. And so like, I worry we're getting so far into the weeds, we might be losing
that's right
here. But it's an important part of the historical record to understand back in 2005, 2006, everything that you're seeing today was predicted. It was predicted by the Israeli Shin Bet. It was predicted by all foreign Western security services and political leaders, from Tony Blair, who was then UK Prime Minister, to Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, President George W. Bush, to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, to James Wolfenson, the head of the World Bank, and the quartet was responsible for negotiations. And everybody was also complicit. Like, this came as no surprise to anyone. My job for 3 years, literally 2005 and 2008, my job was to talk about Gaza 2020, to say that, like, look what is happening in Gaza. If you seal people up, if you continually bomb them, mostly children, if you deprive people of sanitary napkins, diapers, powdered milk, much less access to the rest of the world, and keep them on a starvation diet, which was the policy as described by Dov Weissglass, senior Israeli official and advisor to Sharon, limiting the number of calories into Gaza.
Right.
Guys, nothing good is going to happen from this. And in fact, the UN wrote a report, which you can Google, in 2012 called Gaza 2020, which details all of this. Everything that you're seeing today has been predicted not just for years, but for many decades. And it's just a function of human history. So if we're trying to get to a place where every Israeli and every Palestinian has the fundamental rights that they deserve, we need to be honest about the facts on the ground and the history and the fact that some people want what we're seeing happen to happen because it serves their interest, and they're not interested in protecting the fundamental rights of both Israelis and Palestinians. So
in one sense, Greg, somebody might say, I mean, it would be a very cynical position, but it would be to say that the Israelis, this has been a golden moment for them, because they have been able to do exactly what they've always wanted to do to Gaza and possibly some of the West Bank. And that is to say, to compress all of those people in the South, just utterly destroy the infrastructure. And so in a way, the last 2 years have really been a gift to Israel.
I would push back against that a little bit. I think that is one perspective. So first, I would sort of affirm a core of what I hear you saying.
Yeah.
And
I'm just representing a perspective that's out there.
Right.
It's the most cynical perspective of all, I think.
It is a most cynical perspective. I want to say what I think is right about that, and then I want to also push back a little bit on that. Not that this is your perspective or Rob's perspective.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
So first of all, the long trajectory of Israeli-Palestinian history, the experience of Israeli policy from Palestinians is pretty clear. It's been to take as much Palestinian land as possible with as few Palestinians as possible. This is the Zionist project in conception. I think, like, at a moral level, makes perfect sense. Look, Jewish people have been facing persecution for 2,000 years. Anti-Semitism is real. It's often rooted in bastardized Christianized theologies. Yeah. So Zionism, which is Jewish nationalism, arises mainly in 19th century Europe as a response to European nationalism, which views Jews as the other, and it's constantly scapegoated. So it makes perfect sense. Like, hey, if this is how power is negotiated, and we as Jewish people can't have power in these societies because we're always otherized, we should do what other people do.
Hey, Greg, I've often thought, and you probably would agree with me, that if you and I had been born in about 1875 and we were Jewish, Zionism would be very appealing. By 1890, 1900, it would make a lot of sense, and we probably would sign up.
It would. And, for listeners, like, if you're, look up Martin Buber, look up Hannah Arendt. These are early, late 19th century, then early 20th. Hannah Arendt's probably the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. Like, they were ardent Zionists, but they would probably be considered anti-Zionist today, like by their version of Zionism. So yes, it's a compelling, what you say is, like, for people who care, like, this is a way to say, look, there's this age-old problem. Here we are. We're going to do what other people do. Why can't, if the French and the Italian can have a state of their own, and even though I'm French, they're not recognizing me as a full citizen, why can't I have a Jewish state? The problem with Zionism, and why I'm getting back to this in response to your question, is not Zionism in theory. It's what it meant on the ground, because there were people living there, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, for thousands of years. My family dates back, Christian Palestinians, to actual Pentecost. It's in the Bible right there. And so it's, it was not an empty land, or what you often hear in Zionist rhetoric, a land without a people for people without a land. There were people there. That's the issue. And so the experience of Zionism for the people who were there was to say that you do not matter. And we have to take as much land as possible for us, with as few of you as possible, because the non-Jews among you are a democratic threat. You represent a threat to Israel as this new state in 1948, as both a Jewish and a democratic state. So where I push back to you, against you, is that there's been a variety, not your position, but the position that you articulated, is that there's been a variety of conceptions of Zionism, theoretically and in practice. There is diversity among Israeli voices about what's good for Israel and what's not good for Israel. The dominant thread, as you see, unfettered settlement expansion over many decades, particularly since 1967. You see 1948, the Nakba, the expulsion of the vast majority, 3/4 of the indigenous Palestinian, Muslim, and Christian population to make way for this Jewish state. Never allowed to return, despite what international law says. And so you see this large trajectory, but there's always been a counter narrative there. And there's also, I think, in some sense, I fear this particular moment, because the folks in power in Israel right now definitely want to take as much Palestinian land as possible with as few Palestinians as possible. Some are lamenting openly on Israeli television that they didn't do a good enough job in killing as many people as they could in Gaza, and that they need to double down on this. And so this strain of Zionism, which has become the one that I think we should critique, is on full display right now. But there are counter-Israeli narratives, and I think ultimately right now, if we accept my premise that there's no good future for any Palestinian or Israeli without a good reality for everyone, human rights in equal measure, this does not bode well for Israel, for Palestinians, for Jews, for Muslims, for Christians in the region long term.
Now, Greg, all right, so let's take it to the president just for a second here, if we can, just for time's sake. And that is, Trump has this 20-point plan. Does this create any pathway for Palestinian sovereignty and ultimately a lasting just peace? I mean, talk to us a little bit about what's happening now.
Well, the plan says it does. It says it creates a conditional pathway to Palestinian statehood. But the key is conditional right there. So there's something in Telos that we often talk about. We have these principles and practices of peacemaking. They articulate 6 principles of like what peacemaking actually looks like and 6 practices of like how to get there. And I think it's a tool that some in your networks may or may not find useful. It's pretty accessible. And one principle of peace that we talk about is the idea of justice, which I acknowledge is a charged word. Often justice means just us, just what I think is right and what I think is wrong. But I think if you dive a little bit deeper and you get into, Dr. King has this wonderful quote, which is that peace is not the absence of tension, but it's the presence of justice. It's linking these 2 things together, saying that like there's got to be some foundation that this is built upon. It's not just like calm everything down and we don't see a ceasefire, we don't see any firing, so everything's okay. So the plan that you saw is not a peace plan, it's a ceasefire plan. On the ground, it's hard to say that we have a ceasefire right now. But the problem with the plan is that it entrenches a number of the conditions that actually got us here. So one, Israel's retaining full control over the Gaza Strip. Its troops may not be in all of Gaza right now, but its troops are in the majority of the Gaza Strip. 2, there's no accountability for war crimes, whether they were committed by Hamas or other actors or Israel during what is, I still think, an ongoing genocide, the crime of crimes. 3, there's been no Palestinian consultation in the development of the plan that's meaningful. One of the core principles of peacemaking is another charged word, equity. But when I say equity, think of ownership. Like equality asks, like, who has a seat at the table? But equity asks, whose table is it? Like in peacemaking, we're working for our shared benefit right here. And these are Palestinian communities. And to say that, like, I live in New York City, that I don't have a stakeholder, I don't have a voice in like how my what happens in my community, in my neighborhood, that's insane. And that's what this peace plan said. And the only leadership, it creates a board of peace that's headed by President Trump and former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, and that fast tracks a variety of international business interests into rebuilding Gaza. Like, this is not peace. This is a reformulation of the situation that we saw prior to October 7th, of one group of people ruling over another group of people based on who they are. That is a violent and unjust situation that will only produce rotten fruit. Now, your question, Rob, is this an opportunity? The way that I like to think about things is every significant shift is an opportunity, and we must recognize it as that. And so we must see very clearly what this is. I just named in quite negative terms that this is not a real peace plan. But I think there's an opportunity that we cannot allow ourselves rather to overlook. And that is, this is a significant change. Maybe it's not a true ceasefire, but these are not the days of hundreds of Palestinians being slaughtered. More aid is coming in. This is a good thing. And then also, why did this happen when it happened? You may have some not you specifically, but like you may imagine some this fit the interests of the powers that be. It's the time to reformulate it. But there's a political rationale to this as well. President Trump, this became very costly with a growing split in the U.S. right to maintain this Gaza story in the front page of the news every day. He was having trouble managing some relationships with our closest allies. You'll recall just 2.5 months ago, despite enormous U.S. pressure, the UK, the US, Canada, the UK, and France recognized a Palestinian state in the United Nations. So what was happening, all these protests, the things that you've been doing, Rob and Gary, that may feel like you're just sound and fury screaming into the wind, these were creating a new dynamic that had to be addressed. And so what that means is that as we feel like the weight of this moment, how depressing it feels, we need to be reminded of our agency in this moment, that maybe this isn't the perfect ceasefire. It's not the perfect peace plan. It's not. But the reason we got here, which is better than where we were 6 months ago, was precisely because people like you had the courage to stand up and to say not in our name and to keep speaking out. And now we see things shifting in very dramatic ways.
But Greg, I think things are shifting in the West Bank in a horrific way. I mean, it almost seems like you're creating an untenable situation in the West Bank, so that the prospects for peace just simply don't look any good. I mean, what do you think about that?
I think that's absolutely true, 100%. Just as Gaza disengagement in 2005 was more about what Israel wanted to take in the West Bank than what it wanted from Gaza, the same is true today. It's just at like horrific scale. And the reality that we see on the ground is absolutely untenable.
Right.
And at the same time, I want your listeners to understand that we have incredible agency in this moment. Like right now, the Israeli government is spending millions of dollars. You can look this up, Google this. Faith by Works, Gaza, Israel. Like this is just one example of a $4.1 million contract to make sure that Christians who go to church get Israeli propaganda in their social media feeds. There's another one, $6 million for a 6-week campaign. Mother Agapia, whom many of you may know from her interview with Tucker Carlson, just wrote an important op-ed on this in Word and Way about sort of the targeting of American Christians right now. Like, what I'm trying to get at is not to ignore the horrific reality on the ground, but to remind our listeners that right now, none of this would have happened for decades were it not for American political support. And key to American political support, unfortunately, has been a co-optation of the Christian faith to create constituency and political movement and to transfer hundreds of millions of dollars in support of this modern, what I think, Gary, you've called a modern heresy, and you as well, Rob, of Christian Zionism. Like this is part of the reason why it's happening. And so now as we're seeing these shifts back here in public opinion that have political impact, that's what I'm saying, is you're seeing doubling down on this right now. So the reason why I'm mentioning this is not to overlook the horrors on the ground. That's where we need to, unintended, ground ourselves, but to say that the people who might listen to this conversation, you may feel really lonely right now, but your voices are more important than they've ever been. If you are American and you're Christian, we have a dog in this fight.
And our speaking up is really the one way that's going to actually hopefully bring about any change. Gary, I know you want to add a comment here, but Greg, it seems like the situation in Gaza and in the West Bank is untenable, and that it doesn't almost matter what we do because it's hopeless. Gaza's unlivable. The West Bank is on fire, like literally on fire. The incursion of settlers, the arming of settlers, the violence of settler violence against Palestinians. It seems to me that this is we're in the midst of an expulsion of a genocide and ethnic cleansing of the people of Gaza and the people of the West Bank. And is it too late for us to speak up? I mean, we're going to do so anyways. But in all practical reality, is it past the time of hope now for the people, for the Palestinians?
I mean, that's such a tough case, and I haven't been in 2 years. I have not been on the ground I haven't seen my family, extended family, lives mainly in Bethlehem. I haven't seen them in 2 years, but long ago, like I remember when I was living there 20 years ago, the refrain that I'd hear from my own family was like, "Fish mustaqbal," there's no future. It's a hopeless case. I want to say that because I want to remind people of a couple core principles here. That one, power, wherever it is, this isn't just in Israel-Palestine. Power accomplishes its evil ends when it gets into our hearts and our heads. It removes the idea and the feeling that we have agency, which is so sacred to every human being, that we can just decide what we believe, that our voices matter, that our bodies matter, that this reality matters, that the principles that we believe in about the dignity of human life, this matters. And so it's been always very hard for me, and it's a struggle I fight with every day, particularly these last 2 years to actually, believe that the world could be another way when all the evidence we see is designed to tell us that it won't be. And that's power trying to tell us that we're small and that we don't matter. And I have to say to you that we do, and we have to act like we do, even if the reality feels so much larger than it is, than us, and because it is. There's a quote I often like to come back to from Mitri Raheb, who's a pastor from Bethlehem. And he reminds us of something really important, that hope is not an adjective. Hope is not an emotion. Hope is a verb. He says, hope is what you do. And this is critically important. It feels so loosey-goosey and airy-fairy, but it's exactly what you've been doing your whole lives, Rob and Gary, is you have been showing up despite the fact that it seems impossible. I remember my dad, who's a Palestinian Christian theologian, born and raised outside of Bethlehem, and he'd take the words of the psalmist and he'd phrase this slightly differently. He would say, look, to seek peace and pursue it, that is always the right thing to do, especially when it seems impossible.
Oh, very good. Well,
because what does it matter when it seems obvious? What kind of witness is it? And so this is critical. Now, if you look back historically through the history of the church and the history of the world, you see that before the Berlin Wall came falling down, before the fall of apart, before all of these things, it seemed impossible because it was impossible.
Right.
But these things happen, these changes happen, and they happen rapidly and often in unexpected ways, but not on their own. They only happen when people like you and everyone on this call is saying, no, I refuse to let power get into my head and my heart and make me believe that I, as a citizen of the most powerful country in the history of the world, that has been bankrolling this, that I, as a Christian, I have trouble using that word for myself right now. Happy to talk about that, but to be transparent, that I, as a Christian, when this genocide is being committed and sanctified with my theology and in my name, that my voice does not matter. No, right now, I say to you, like when you say, is everything lost? I say, I know that's not what you believe, Rob, but I say to you, like, this is exactly the moment. What power do Christians have to witness anything if they don't stand up and say, right now, Jesus's name is being used in vain to sanctify horror, when he unequivocally called people, no matter the hour or the day, to be peacemakers and to sanctify the dignity of every human life. This is the moment more than any other to practice hope. And this is the moment when our voices have more power than they ever have. So despite the horrors and because of the horrors that we're seeing right now, this is the time when we need to stand up and speak loudly and clearly and show that there is a different way, because there is.
Yeah, Greg, I really like how you actually are presenting a word here that we don't often hear on this podcast. And that is, you're really trying to diagnose what is happening inside of us. Because I think there are many people who are living inside of the community that is standing with Palestine, who's calling out the injustice issues, and feel a lot of despair right now. And they really don't feel they have any agency. They don't think this is a moment. All moments have been lost. And so therefore, despair, I think, is running through so many people. So I really like how you've framed this. So the question is, okay, so we do have this very powerful nation that we belong to. We are going to be involved in the rebuilding of Gaza some way or another. It's going to happen. So do you also find hopefulness when you begin imagining what might be rebuilt in Gaza? Does that give you also some grounds for hope? So maybe you can just reflect on that a little bit. I don't know if I want to see Trump City built in Gaza.
Yeah.
I saw a meme that had something like that, and I thought, oh my gosh, please, Lord, save. I can't also imagine that Israel would want to see the rebuilding of Gaza without it depopulating some of Gaza. So anyway, as your imagination works around sort of what could be in Gaza, how does that? Where are the places we need to lean in to find hopefulness?
I mean, that's a great question. Like, and I want to begin like sort of meeting you where you are by being frank about where I am. And like, I don't feel hopeless. I feel an incredible sense of despair. The last 2 years, like I felt, and I hate to center my emotional state
Hmm.
during the horrors that so many people I know in throughout Palestine and also Israel. I spent a lot of time. I've been many dozens, probably about 50 times to the communities along the Gaza border where the October 7th massacres happened that affected many people I know in horrific
Right.
ways.
Right.
And so I don't want to minimize any human suffering anywhere, but or center my own emotions. But in response to this question, like I felt like my whole life has been an absolute failure. Like
Mm.
because like I spent 30 years working professionally on this issue. I spent 3 years talking with the most powerful people in the world about Gaza 2020, years before 2023. Like, and so many of us in the sort of like pro peace camp, whatever, who believe that like
Right.
human rights is human security, which I think is demonstrable. If you look to all the data and whatnot,
Yeah.
like create a
Yeah.
safer world for us, we all got to have like basic fundamental rights, right? And the only time the world paid attention to us, but not us, but like Palestinians, I mean, but like to Israel Palestine is in response to a horrific massacre. Like it's just like, my God, like come on, like this has been it's been so horrible on so many levels.
Yeah.
And so I do want to reflect back, like many people I know feel similarly in this space, like everything that we did failed, like,
Mhm.
and what else is there to do? But I also want to say that this, peacemaking, it can't be simply about us. We
Right.
need to recognize that this is a story larger than us. It's not about our egos. If people fighting apartheid in South Africa just sat down and said, like, this is the way, and it's getting worse, which it was, apartheid would still be here. If
Yeah.
abolitionists who knew that it was impossible to get rid of slavery in their lifetime said,
Yeah.
no, like I'm not going to do anything because it's impossible, this wouldn't happen. And
Yep.
so where I think we are today is we're at an extraordinary moment of opportunity. And that sounds totally dissonant with what I just said. And the
Mhm.
reason I say that is so many more people are paying attention in a new way. So many more people are listening. And you ask the question, the moral imagination. I hope that we do two things. Not only do we resist what's horrible and name our failures, but we do what people on the so-called other side have been doing for many decades. They've been envisioning, they've been working towards something specific. And I hope we take this opportunity to say that, like, wait a second, Israel, Palestine, many of your listeners may not be familiar with the history, but there was a time 150 years ago when Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived
Right.
together in this province of the Ottoman Empire called Palestine. And
Right.
it wasn't perfect, just as it's not perfect anywhere, but it was good. It was like there was shared community, and there were shared rights for people, and there are long stretches of the Holy Land where people actually got together and did well. It was a place of intersection, multi-faith, multicultural existence. It's an indigenous, it's the birthplace of Judaism, but also the birthplace of Christianity and sacred
Mm.
to Islam. There are these other examples there. Now, we need to be creative right now by saying, one, there is another way, even if we can't see it, even if it's not going to happen in our lifetimes. We need to be people of faith, whether we are in a traditional sense or not, to understand that we will never get there unless people like us say this is our work to do
Greg,
right
can
now.
can I go back and just sort of just refocus on what you just said about 150 years ago? And I have read plenty about that period. Let's just say anything before 1900, just for the sake of argument. Jews, Muslims, and Christians who were living in, say, Jerusalem or Bethlehem, they were living in closer proximity to each other culturally. There was a shared, for instance, diet. There was a lot of shared culture that they were able to experience together, which makes for the possibility of a cultural glue that gets them to be able to live together in greater harmony. So when I look at 2021 and I say to myself, well, okay, so you've got Palestinians, you've got Christian Muslim Palestinians, but really the Judaism that you have inside of Israel today, especially those who are the conservative ones, they're European. They come out of Zionism, comes out of this European nationalism. In other words, when I was talking about the shared diet and the shared music from the 19th century,
And
are
shared
these
language.
are these communities further apart today, which makes it more difficult for them to
Right.
live together?
The short answer, yes. What happened over the course of the 20th century in a response to the rise of Zionism was a reformulation of
Of
identity
Judaism.
and
Yes,
culture.
exactly right.
And this is important to Nate, like Israelis and Palestinians, as we talk about them today, may claim roots in antiquity, but these identities are modern identities that arose mainly in the 20th century.
Right.
If you go back to the 19th century, many people don't understand that Hebrew was a liturgical language. It was a dead
Right.
spoken language for many centuries. And still today, for many observant Jews in Israel, 20% of whom are anti-Zionist, by the way, many Orthodox Jews within Israel, they don't speak Hebrew. They think it's only reserved, it's too holy of a language. It's God's language, and it should be, they don't speak it on a daily basis. They don't want to profane the language. And so what you saw, like with the rise of Zionism, was sort of this mixing with a religion, Judaism, and a political project, which was a response to European nationalism. And so there's been this cleavage, and you saw it around the Middle East too. It's important to note that throughout the Middle East and North Africa, for many centuries, millennia even, there were vibrant Jewish communities that in a period of just a few decades after the founding of Israel were largely gutted. And now there's just sort of remnants of these communities, and tiny, just a few people in places like Egypt and Jordan and whatnot. So the idea of proximity is key. The thing that I want to hold there, there's this massive like shift on a global geopolitical identity stage. One of the things when we're thinking about social transformation that gets us tripped up is that we tend to see the world as it always will be. And we're in the midst of one of these moments in which all of this is shifting again. I'm here in New York City. We just elected a mayor who's openly anti-Zionist, Zohran Mamdani. That may be controversial for people on the call or whatever, but like,
it's a surprise. No one saw
30
that coming.
Jewish New Yorkers voted for him. A majority of New Yorkers under 30 voted for him. We're in a time of re-examination of these identities and these boxes that we were, placed in about 100 years ago. And I think that will have consequences on the ground in Israel, Palestine as well.
So you would have to say then that even though there is not the same proximity culturally among these people in the Middle East as in the 19th century, but there could be something that we cannot quite see yet, and that would be a re-examination by younger people of what their identity is going to be living in a place, just like in New York.
Well, I do think it's much more difficult on the ground because like what you saw over the last 20 years was a real separation between people into literal almost cages for Palestinians, and now people don't interact. But I will say this is important as a conceptual level, and I understand we're closing in on the end of this. But this is a point that I'm going to say some sensitive things, which I think often get lost in the broader cultural conversation right now. So first of all, we often view these narratives in opposition. Holocaust versus Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe. Holocaust, we know from World War II. Nakba is around Israel's founding just a few years after World War II, which the majority of Palestinians, both Muslim and Christian, 75%, were kicked off their lands, never allowed to return, despite the United Nations resolution saying they have a right of return on international law. Now, these things are actually should not be viewed in opposition. There's been a lot of sociological discussion around this for some time now, where it's viewed through a trauma lens and Nakba as being an outgrowth, a continuation of Holocaust almost. So that these, it's a transference of trauma, and you will. So what I'm trying to say, why I'm connecting this, and there's some great books and articles around this for those who are more academically minded, but it's a simple human principle that we understand. But why this is relevant right now for this conversation is that I think that today, more than ever, Jewish and Palestinian realities and futures are intertwined. The eggs have been scrambled. Our futures are locked in together. One thing that I often like to name and rail against is something that's not in the cultural space, which is anti-Palestinian racism, that we don't have, like, we're presumed to be anti-Semitic
Right.
just because of our ethnicity. We're this modern people who, despite our historic connections to the land, back to the time of Jesus and before, Jesus was Jewish, who sparked this new religion, like, and his first followers were Jewish Palestinian. Like, there's this connection. Like, there's all of these anti-Palestinian tropes. But something that we do, and that those need to be named, and this needs to be resisted, particularly in Christian circles. But there's something else that is in the public square, which is weaponized, and that's anti-Semitism. As we talked about, anti-Semitism is a real scourge. Another sensitive point I want to make, whether anti-Semitism is weaponized or not, like, the whole rationale around Zionism is an antidote to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism obviously directly affects Jewish people, but it also indirectly affects Palestinians. And so we see this rise in anti-Semitism, like, around the world, around our country, and that's having a profound effect at will on Palestinians too. And so you're talking about this reformulation of identity. I think it's important to come back to this core point, which is that the future and realities of Palestinians and Jews are now intertwined.
Hey, Greg, first off, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Can you tell us a little bit before we go about the Tell Us group, your work, what you do, and how people can follow you guys and get involved with what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. Telos, we are a peacemaking organization. We exist to help build communities in which we can all flourish by unleashing our power to confront injustice. Our work on Israel-Palestine primarily focuses on America's relationship to Israel-Palestine. We believe there would not be these horrors on the ground for Palestinians or Israelis if America took a different approach in our policy and in our culture. So we're trying to promote safety, dignity, freedom, justice, equality for all Palestinians and Israelis in equal measure. A lot of our work happens to be with Christians, as both of you know. It is the Holy Land after all, and Christians have unwittingly driven the horrors that we see on the ground, but we also think that Christians are key to helping point us to a different reality. You can sign up for our emails on the website, or there's another campaign that we're participating in with a variety of organizations, which we helped launch. It's called Red Candle, redcandle.org. It's around Christmas. It's the center of Palestine and peacemaking, Palestinian Christianity. Go to redcandle.org to check that out. First Light is going to come to Bethlehem this Saturday, and you'll see a number of people passing the flame, calling for just peace around the world, hopefully, from lighting red candles in solidarity with Palestinians and Palestinian Christians on the ground.
So is Talos still organizing trips that one of our listeners could join to go to Israel, Palestine?
Yeah, one of our historic programs has been these pilgrimages to Israel, Palestine that are real deep transformational experiences. Those were on pause the last couple of years. If you go to our website and sign up for our newsletter, website's really out of date, but the newsletter's up to date. You'll get more information about that. We're hoping to relaunch the pilgrimages in March of 2026, and you can apply to be on those first trips.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I've been on those, and they're fantastic. I appreciate it so much.
I have a long list of friends who, wanted to not just go on pilgrimage to see holy sites, but they actually wanted a fuller understanding of this conflict and to come away well informed. Telos trips transformational.
Yeah, they are. They're fantastic, and Greg is fantastic.
Yeah, it's perhaps the best in the country right now.
Let me also mention really quickly here, next week we have another live stream with Johanna Catenaccio talking about Israeli, Palestinian or Arab Israelis, their rights, their hopes, and things that are happening there. And then in 2 weeks, the church must respond to Palestine, the Crossroads Declaration. Ben Norquist and I will be discussing that, what it means, and some other things. Greg is going to have a good charge to, hey, we need to do something and take action. And this will be one way that we can maybe do so. So thank you so much, Greg, for your time.
Thanks, Greg.
And for your friendship and everything that you've given to us. So
thank you, both heroes of mine. I'm so grateful for your solidarity and your witness over many, many years. It does not go unnoticed. You've been pioneers in this space, and millions of people's lives, despite the horror that we're seeing, are fundamentally better, and they're being called to a more authentic version of themselves and their faith because of the two of you. So just thank you for allowing me to be a conversation.
Appreciate that very much.
Yeah, very much. Thank you so much. All right.